So tonight's presentation is titled Participatory Artificial Intelligence for Mapping in Deprived Areas. And our guest speaker is Dr. Grant Tregonning, Research Associate at the Urban Big Data Centre, University of Glasgow. Grant is a geospatial scientist with a particular interest in climate change, sustainability, inequalities, and citizen science. He mainly uses participatory urban analytical methods to understand issues associated with urban sustainability and livability in deprived areas. He is currently situated at the Urban Big Data Centre within the University of Glasgow. And prior to joining Glasgow, Grant was a research fellow in the geospatial data science at the University of Warwick and worked on a number of projects, including the Creating Interfaces, Slum Mapping, and Data and Displacement initiatives. Previous to Warwick, Grant was a visiting research fellow at the University of Auckland and completed a PhD in geospatial science at Newcastle University. While studying for his master's degree at Queen Mary University of London, Grant was a bursary recipient of the Water Conservators University's programme. So at this point, I'll pass over to tonight's guest speaker, Grant.
Thanks, Rob. Lovely to see you all, and thank you for having me today. So, hi everybody, my name is Grant Tregonning. As Rob mentioned, I'm a research associate at the University of Glasgow, and I'm going to be talking to you about one of the projects that I'm working on. So, as Rob mentioned, I'm a researcher in participatory urban analytics. And what is that tongue twister? Well, it's a blend of two different worlds. You've got participatory research, which is things like citizen science and placing people right at the center of research and having opportunities for co-design and exchange of dialogue and co-learning practices as well. So making sure that we don't exclude communities and don't exclude people and their voices, and trying to place them right at the center of our research and the project as well. And so I blend participatory research methods with another world, which is urban analytics. And this is where we start talking about computational methods, analytical methods, data science, artificial intelligence, and other things like machine learning as well. And I'm going to show you a project today that I'm involved in. I'm leading a couple of work packages within the project, and that's kind of encompassing lots of different aspects of participatory urban analytics. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see the presentation that I have today. But yeah, feel free to drop some questions in the chat. And I'm really looking forward to having a discussion after I've been speaking as well. I will leave my email with Rob afterwards. If you have any questions and you want to get in touch, or you want to become more involved with the project or with another topic, which I'll talk about later on, feel free to get in touch with me as well. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll just share my screen. Okay, just want to check that everybody can see that.
Yeah, that's fine, Grant.
Perfect. All right, so I'm going to be talking to you about the Idea Maps data ecosystem project that I am involved in. So the Idea Maps data ecosystem is quite a large international project, which has been growing for quite a number of years. And I'm going to try and take you through a step-by-step process of how it came about and where we're at the moment, and introduce this idea or this concept of participatory urban analytics or participatory artificial intelligence for mapping slums in developing countries in Africa and Asia, and soon to be rolling out across different cities globally as well. So what is the Idea Maps data ecosystem? Well, what we really aim to achieve in the project and through our mapping activities is to create an integrated data ecosystem. And this is an online ecosystem that anybody can access, and I'm going to show you what it looks like a little bit later. It's an online data ecosystem of various different maps of slums and informal settlements and deprived areas across low to middle income countries. And we're going to be focusing primarily on two countries here, Nigeria and Kenya, which are our pilot cities, and specifically Lagos, which some of you will know in Nigeria, and then Kano, which is a little bit lesser known in the northern part of Nigeria. And then another city, Nairobi in Kenya as well. So I'm going to showcase 3 examples of pilot cities that we've been running this project across over the past 3 or 4 years. We've got some website links for you there, a shameful plug, but if any of you want to get involved more or actually read just a little bit more about the project and see what we're up to, feel free to click on the website there. We do have a mailing list as well, so we can keep you guys up to date if you would like to keep in the loop with our various activities. So what is the Idea Maps data ecosystem? Well, I kind of mentioned at the beginning that this has been an idea that has been growing for really quite some time. Back in 2019, a group of researchers, we started to collaborate and come up with some ideas for mapping deprivation in slums and informal settlements, particularly in low to middle income countries where these types of spaces are very prevalent and more common. We recognise that these spaces, unlike their counterparts, often remain invisible. When you go on Google Maps or when you try and get a map of these spaces, they are often invisible, and there's not a lot of information on these spaces, let alone the types of deprivation that they are exposed to. When you compare that to the UK, which has indices of deprivation in lots of detail, when you move into a sort of slum or an informal settlement, there's very little data or information on this. And if there is data, it might not be very complete or of a high quality. And so we recognized these problems and decided, let's try and come together and see if we can develop some methods to identify deprivation in slums. And what is deprivation in slums? What does deprivation look like across different slums and across different countries? Is it the same? Can we use modeling techniques to do this? And is it scalable and repeatable as well? So that kind of started off in 2019, and then we have various branches of the Idea Maps networking grant that has grown since then. We've got Idea Maps Sudan, Data for Human Rights, ID Atlas, and then the Idea Maps data ecosystem, which I'm going to be talking to you about today. I mentioned earlier that the project is an international and interdisciplinary project. We've got people from all walks of life, all different backgrounds, and various different organizations as well. You're just seeing a handful of the organizations that are involved in the project, and I'll showcase some more that are involved in the project a little bit later. But on the left of the screen here in the orange cells, you've got the team members from University of Glasgow, including me, working on lots of different aspects of data and modeling, and then people from all different backgrounds, from Nigeria, from Kenya, from the US, from the Netherlands, from Australia, from various different aspects of the globe. And so we all come together, we all collaborate, we all share our knowledge and our skills, and we're trying to, as I mentioned earlier, map deprivation. Who else is involved in the project, though? So we have various other members involved in the networking grant. So this was from 2020 to 21. Various different people involved in that. And then it's kind of grown and evolved into the Idea Maps network, which I've just shown you. And we're currently funded primarily by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Bill and Melinda Gates primarily fund projects that are involved in low to middle income countries and utilize technology or develop technologies to improve situations inside of these spaces. And so the Idea Maps network and the work that we had been developing and evolving over the past couple of years really fit this niche, and we're really happy to be working with them. They allow a lot of flexibility in the research as well as it evolves, where some sort of funders, previous funders that we've worked with, don't always allow for that flexibility. And it's great because we are trying to incorporate a co-learning aspect of the project as well. So as we move forward, we might have some feedback from various people, and that might actually affect the direction that we're moving into, or the types of methods that we're doing, or the things that we're looking at. And so the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation allows flexibility for that. So if you want to change your methods or your outcomes or your aims or your objectives, it allows for a little bit more flexibility than what some of our previous funders would have allowed us to do. And that's where we're really, really happy to be working with them. And they're really enabling us to do that sort of co-learning process as well. So a bit more about the project. It launched in January 2023. As I mentioned, though, it's been evolving and developing over quite a number of years. We have 5 different work streams involved in the project. We've got the platform, which I'll showcase a little bit later. This is an online platform for showcasing our outputs and allowing for participatory feedback from different people. We've got the modeling aspect, we've got the data aspect, and then we've got another really important factor, which is about engagement and learning. So how do we engage with different communities and stakeholders, and how do we adopt a co-learning process as well? And we've got 3 pilot cities that we're focusing on at the moment in the current phase. This is Lagos, Kano, and Nairobi. And then we've got various pilot cities which we will be evolving into in the very near future, in the next phase, in the next couple of months. And they'll be all over the world. And we'll be rolling out the methods that I'm showcasing to you today across those different pilot cities. What else do we do in this project that kind of makes it a bit novel? Typically in modeling or computational research, it's very top down. So computational scientists or data scientists or modelers take a top down approach, and we tend to walk into a space and say to people, hey, don't tell me what your problem is. I know what your problem is. I've done all the reading. I've come to your country. I've visited it. I've done loads of modeling. I've read all the papers. Don't tell me what your problem is. I'm going to find a solution for you. It's going to work great. No, don't open your mouth. Don't tell me. It's going to be brilliant. What tends to happen with that is because it's very top down, it excludes the voices of various communities and stakeholders that would be highly influential in giving great feedback and direction for the project and for the methods that we're doing. And so what we're trying to do is incorporate this engagement and learning process, this co-learning process, and place people right at the center of the modeling process and the research as well. So trying to make sure that communities that live within these spaces or that know these spaces, and stakeholders that work in these spaces, or decision makers that work in these spaces or have the opportunity to influence these spaces, we try and place these voices right at the center of the project so that we can co-learn from one another and design a modeling process together. And so these types of people are actually involved in all aspects of the project. That's right at the design, the development, and the implementation of the project. So it's a really exciting process. You can imagine it's quite difficult having so many voices, but it's equally just as exciting. And what we find is that the outputs and the models that we develop are actually much more grounded in lived realities of the people that we're trying to serve. It makes the outputs much more holistic and useful and impactful as well. You can imagine if we're listening to the voices or listening to the needs of the people and grounding those right in the middle of the project, you can imagine those needs are being met more holistically. And so that's what we try and do. And that's the participatory aspect of the modeling of the artificial intelligence, deep learning, and machine learning processes that we take. So we hold lots of different workshops. We call these PAR workshops. They're participatory action research workshops. It's basically where we get together with different community groups and stakeholders, and we run various activities to get feedback from these types of people. In certain aspects, in certain activities, sorry, we might ask people to take photos of particular factors of deprivation or something that they think might be important. And we do that through various base map or field activities. We give them iPads, we run large workshop activities, and we ask them to go into these deprived spaces and take photos of what they might think is deprivation. Of course, we have an idea of deprivation, a Western idea of deprivation, because that's where we live and in what we're influenced by. And so these activities are really important because these photos, these photo voices, what we call them, allows us to capture deprivation in a way that is grounded in the eyes of the community and the people that live in these cities. So really cool and important work that we do there. We have co-design workshops. So as I mentioned, this is right from the design, the development and implementation of the project. And we run these in our 3 pilot cities. So we go to these spaces and we run large workshops with lots of different communities and stakeholders to co-design the approaches that we're doing. I'm going to showcase some of these other things a little bit later on, which is the ranking of subdomains. What is a subdomain? I'm going to talk about that a little bit later on, and the prioritization of deprivation that we're modeling, and some of the maps that I'll showcase these a little bit later as well, these subdomains of deprivation. So don't worry if those 3 larger bullet points at the bottom there don't make a lot of sense. I'm going to talk to you about those in more detail a little bit later on. But just wanted to give you a flavour of some of the participatory activities and processes that we try and integrate in the project throughout all different aspects of the project. So what is slum mapping? And what actually is mapping? There are lots of different ways to map, not just map slums, but just to map in general. But focusing primarily on mapping of slums, there's 4 main methods of kind of doing that. The first being field mapping, the second being census and surveys, the third being digitizing imagery, and the fourth being computational models as well. So field mapping, that's typically where you would go into the fields, you would go onto the site, and you would use a GPS device. It could be a phone, it could be an iPad, a tablet, or just a small handheld GPS device as well. What we tend to do is we tend to go into these spaces and we ask people to create points and tags with those points as they walk through that space. And they could walk to a building, create a point, and say this is a hospital. They could walk to another building and say this is a residential location. They could walk to another point and say this is a water and sanitation facility, and then provide some more information on that as well. We have census surveys. This is where people will go to the homes of different community members and ask them quite detailed questions on their household or on them as an individual. And that could be to do with their health, their education, their income, their background, lots of different aspects. You can imagine these first 2 methods, the field mapping and the census surveys, you can imagine they're quite expensive in terms of time, energy, and people power. They take a long time to do, and you require a lot of sort of specialist knowledge to be able to go and do those. But very, very holistic. They often are high quality, and we end up getting a lot of information from them, particularly at the household level. We then have digitizing imagery. This is typically where somebody will remotely draw aspects of these spaces. So that could be somebody sitting at home in the UK. They zoom in on a map of some data that we've given them, and they might draw boundaries of that map, or they might turn that data into a polygon or a shape or a boundary of a building. Or they might take some data and turn it into a point so that we know a particular location of something. This is a little bit quicker, but it's not as rich as the other two sort of mapping approaches. And it can also be done remotely, which is really good. You don't actually have to be in the space. So it's quite scalable. You could have hundreds of people working on that, hundreds of volunteers using citizen scientists to be able to perform those types of approaches. And then we have computer models. And this is where we start introducing aspects such as artificial intelligence, deep learning methods, machine learning methods, and we use various different data sets to do that. It could be quantitative data, so numerical data sets. It could be satellite imagery. It could be Google Street View images. If you want to understand what's actually going on the ground within a sort of 3D space, can you use Google Street View images to understand what's going on inside these spaces? And so these computer models are very fast and scalable depending on the computing power that you have. However, not always as holistic as the other approaches, and they're not always as able to recognize what's actually going on the ground as a household survey might be able to do. So you can sort of see here these individual slum mapping approaches, these silos of slum mapping approaches have their own sort of advantages and disadvantages. And so what we're trying to do in idea maps is combine all of these different approaches to generate a real holistic understanding of what's actually happening within these spaces. I remember I started the conversation at the beginning of the presentation talking about these spaces being very data scarce and not very rich or have high quality of data. And so we're trying to fill this gap and meet the gap and try and complete the sort of data scarcity that we find in slums and informal settlements. So we have a better understanding of what's actually going on there. So what do we envision to do together? So first of all, we hope to improve data on slums and deprivation across the different cities and try and update this regularly. So can we create methods that are scalable and repeatable across the different cities? And by doing so, we want to improve our understanding of the assets, so the good things in these spaces, and the challenges at a community level. And again, update this as regularly as possible. So create methods that can be repeatable and scalable across different cities. And by doing so, you can imagine if we have a better understanding of the assets and the challenges within these different communities, we hope to therefore improve the capacity and use the data for evidence-based decision-making activities to alleviate some of these challenges and address some of the needs of the communities as well. And that would therefore lead to actions and interventions by the different organisations that we work with, and then meet the other needs, which are kind of these international goals that we have within the Sustainable Development Goals, which are a set of UN Sustainable Development Goals, more specifically, one of those goals being sustainable cities and communities. So that's kind of meeting the needs, I guess, in scholarship, so methods and data, filling that gap, but then meeting the needs and driving action at a community level, and then also meeting the needs and goals at an international level as well. And that's what we're trying to do within this project. So meet various needs and attend various goals there. Talked to you earlier about blending these two different worlds, so participatory methods with urban analytical methods, or participatory methods with computational methods. And what we've tried to do is generate a co-production process. So I mentioned earlier about this co-learning process and co-production of methods and data within the project. And that's what you're seeing here. You've got this first central loop. I'll just move my mouse over. You've got this first central loop here. We're starting right in the center here, grounding our ideas and grounding our methods within the communities, and then moving through this first loop here, and then reaching a second loop here. These first segments are more about communities, so grounding our ideas with the communities, generating ideas that are actionable with city decision makers or urban decision makers or evidence-based decision makers, and then creating something that is transnational and impactful and transformative, sorry, and then moving through to something that is more technical. Are we able to, is it feasible as an idea? Is it feasible as a method? Is it scalable? Can we repeat this across our different pilot cities? And then you can imagine we move through another loop here as well. So it's kind of generative. So it's something that doesn't ever stop. We always want to be having feedback from the communities and the stakeholders. And we imagine that this process will never stop. So it's something that is constantly evolving as the needs of our community members and our stakeholders change as well. So we create something, we create an initial idea, and then once we've generated an initial idea and generated some first outputs within this first circle here, we then get some feedback from the different community members, and this whole process starts again. So how are we engaging with multiple stakeholders? I mentioned earlier we've got these 5 different work packages, 2 of which being about engagement and learning. We have various different activities that occur throughout the project. We've got participatory action research groups. So these are across our 3 different pilot cities in Lagos and Kano. And we work with two large communities within these different spaces. So these are community members that live within informal settlements, deprived areas, and slums. And so we work with these groups and conduct various participatory activities, some of which I'd mentioned earlier in the presentation. We also work with local government members and liaisons that work with government and that work with sort of evidence-based, within evidence-based decision-making practices. We have one each city liaison member. So this is a contact that works within government, within each of our pilot cities. And they are really, really important, just equally as important as the community members for connecting us with, I guess, ideas and actions that are realistic and grounding our ideas in some of the current actions and practices that their governments work within. So really, really important, and again grounds our work within sort of the lived realities of the communities as well, and the lived realities of the city. We have multiple multi-stakeholder workshops, and these are across the different cities. We hold one of these annually. This year we were in Nairobi, and then last year we were so I was in Kenya, and then last year we were in Lagos, in Nigeria. And I also got to go to Kano as well, which is a northern city in Nigeria. And we host one of these multi-stakeholder workshops, and we hold one of those annually. So that means that we go to these cities and we get all these different community members, this melting pot of people into one space, into one room, and we get everybody involved in these different activities. We get all their feedback. It's brilliant. It's really exciting. And we also get an opportunity for those types of communities to exchange dialogue as well. You can imagine that people that live in slums or informal settlements don't always get the opportunity to exchange dialogue and express their needs and learn from stakeholder members as well. So these are members of government, members of the UN, and so just as equally important for that co-exchange of dialogue between those two very different groups, to learn and listen to one another as well. So really, really cool stuff, and it's one of my favorite aspects of the job. I also run a community of practice, which is an international community of different modelers. These are people that are experts in the field. There's about 120 of us at the moment. We meet every 2 months, sometimes a little bit more frequently than that, and we discuss various aspects of deprivation mapping or deprivation modeling or slum modeling or artificial intelligence. And we come together and we try and supercharge some of these activities and make things a little bit more efficient in our scholarship and our research as well. All different people are involved in that. We have people from slums and informal settlements working in these spaces. We've got academics, researchers, scientists, artists, lots of different people part of this community of practice. And it's really active and an exciting space to be part of. There is one aspect that I'm going to talk to you about a little bit later, which is about the current flood crisis and eviction crisis ongoing in Nairobi. And that's something that the community of practice that I'm leading is also pushing forward, and trying to get some traction there and try and support these communities in getting a home and somewhere to live. And then we also have some team co-design workshops, and we have those about 2 or 3 every 2 or 3 weeks. We get together as an internal teams, the Idea Maps team, that was that grid of people, and we get together and we will disseminate what we're all up to. We all have different things that we're all working on, and the co-design workshop's an opportunity for us to disseminate our work, bring everybody up to speed on what we're up to, and get feedback as well, which is of course very important. Very interdisciplinary group, and shared and different perspectives is super important for the project. Oops, sorry, clicked a little bit too far ahead there. Let me just see if that will come back. Let me see. Yeah. Oops. That will not stay for some reason. I'm just gonna come off that and just show you the screen instead, because for some reason that animation does not like it. Okay, so what we have here is one of the outputs from our participatory activities that we ran right at the beginning of the project. So we first wanted to know what is deprivation. Can everybody see this matrix, by the way? It's a red and green matrix. Can you see that?
Yeah, I think It's quite small though, Grant. Yeah, I
So
don't
let's
know.
have a
It's
look.
coming up for others.
Let me try and zoom in.
That's better.
That'd be
Brilliant.
better, yeah. So thanks, Rob. So what we have here is an output from one of the activities that we ran. We wanted to first understand what is deprivation in your area, and what would you like us to first model? What do you think is important for us to model, and what sort of things would you like to see being turned into a map? And so we have desirability on this side here. So these are things that people would really like at the top, and then that they're not so interested in or they don't think is as important as the other aspects as well. We originally started with 100 different aspects of deprivation, and we narrowed it down to these, I think, around about 25 here on what you're seeing on the screen, just to keep things nice and simple. So things that people thought were most important. So these are the community members and stakeholders that thought were most important in slums and informal settlements in which they live or work or influence. Then things that were a little bit less important to them that within their spaces. And then we also thought as modelers, okay, but what is feasible? What do we think we can actually model within the time and the restrictions and the data sets that we have access to? And so we kind of created this little Goldilocks zone here, which is this dashed green line, which is factors of deprivation that are both desirable, highly important to our community members, but also feasible and possible to model in this particular phase. Now, it's not saying that these other aspects of deprivation won't be modelled within the project. It's just that at that current phase, this is what we were going to focus on. We do intend to model all of these different aspects as well. I'll just restart the presentation just from that slide there. And so we ended up with whittling it down to sort of 6 subdomains of deprivation that we were going to model in the first phase of the project. And so this includes flooding, very, very important aspect. These people tend to live in highly precarious flood zones. Some of the slums that we work with, there's one called Makoko. It's very, very interesting space. Makoko in Lagos, it's a slum where about 80% of it is actually on the water. A lot of the buildings are on stilts. There's no roads. People get around using a canoe or a boat or a makeshift floating device. They have schools and hospitals in these spaces. That people live in them, they work, they play in these spaces. It's a really, really interesting space, and would definitely encourage you to take a look at Makoko afterwards. Now, of course, you can imagine, though, that these spaces, both beautiful and interesting, also have their intricacies and challenges as well. And so flooding is one of those aspects, just as is water and sanitation. In these spaces, we tend to see that people have difficulties or challenges associated with water and sanitation and hygiene, and therefore we really wanted to model that as well. We also wanted to look at deprivation overall. Can we paint a picture of what deprivation looks like overall in these spaces? Rather than looking at it individually on a more granular level, can we look at it on a more generic level? Morphological informality, a little bit of a tongue twister, but it's basically anything that encompasses roads or infrastructure and buildings. You can imagine this is a massive factor associated with deprivation in these spaces. Lots of small, densely clustered buildings that might not be arranged in the same formal way that you might see in less deprived areas. Electricity being another major factor, and waste, of course, being another major factor as well. And so these are the 6 subdomains of deprivation that we wanted to model in this first phase. Now, what does that look like? Okay, so I'm not going to go through this in detail because even for some of the advanced modelers on the team, this is a lot of information to digest. This is months of work that you're seeing here, but this is just one model that we generated in the project to create maps of those subdomains that you've just seen. So what you're seeing here is a model that creates maps or outputs using machine learning, deep learning, or artificial intelligence techniques to create maps of deprivation subdomains. And you're seeing here a model that creates maps of building morphometrics. So these are maps that look at the density of buildings, how buildings are kind of arranged to one another. Are they formally planned? Do they orient a little bit differently to a road, as you would see in a more formal space where they might be parallel or perpendicular to one another? Are the buildings large or small? Are they densely structured to one another? And so this model created two maps, one of irregularity, so of planning of these buildings and these spaces, and another identifying a map which highlights areas which have buildings that are small and densely clustered together. So you can imagine these maps are super useful for us to understand what's actually going on in these spaces. Are these spaces formally planned? Do these spaces have buildings that are small and dense and clustered together? What's actually going on in these spaces? But what you're actually seeing here is a model right at the beginning where we have to get the data. So we have to try and find data that is open source, available globally. And so we first get data that allows us to perform these types of modeling approaches across cities around the world. We then create some metrics. These are things that we can measure. So the size of buildings, the density of buildings, how close they are to one another, how are they oriented or arranged or aligned with one another. So we create some metrics. We then reduce the different metrics and variables that we're interested in. Can we get a handful of metrics that allow us to explain the majority of things that are going on in these spaces? We then find metrics that are associated specifically with slums. We find metrics that are values that help us explain and describe these slum spaces. And we then create some maps of slums. So we create some outputs of slums. And this is what you're seeing here. This is one of the outputs which tells us whether or not a space is deprived or not deprived. So this is again using these computational methods that I've highlighted earlier that falls under this umbrella of machine learning, deep learning, artificial intelligence. And they basically use a similar modeling approach to the one that you've just seen before to create outputs within a grid level. And this is what the model assumes to be deprived. These are these orange cells that you're seeing, and areas that are perhaps not deprived, making the assumption that these cells are not deprived. And these blue cells that you're seeing here. Kibera is a very large informal settlement, one of the long-standing informal settlement slums in Nairobi. Very, very well known, highly densely populated slum, and very important slum to the city. Provides lots and lots of different amenities, facilities, manufacturing goods to the city. Very, very important keystone to the city. And so the model did very well in identifying that. The model, however, has also identified some spaces that might not necessarily be classed as deprived. And we noticed that through our own lived experience and knowledge of these spaces. And so what we wanted to do was we wanted to take these outputs, again, remembering this participatory approach that we're taking in the project, we wanted to take these outputs to our community members, to our stakeholders and say, hey, what have we got right here? What is wrong? Do you agree with this? Do you disagree with it? What would you like to see done differently? Is this useful to you? How could we make it more useful? Would you use it now? Is this causing offence or harm? Those types of things. And so we wanted to take that to the community and we thought, okay, let's think about how we can take this map and put it onto a platform that would allow people to give feedback on the information that they are seeing. And so we developed an app. It's a phone app and a computer website. Basically, you can just type in the URL and you can use your computer to go onto the website and you can click on a cell and you can provide feedback. So basically, you would click on a cell here and then you can provide feedback on whether or not you agree or disagree with the information that is seen there. That then allows us as modelers to go home, digest this information and see where the model is getting things right or wrong. How can we improve that model? Why is it getting it wrong there? What can we teach the model so that it learns differently? And so that's what these participatory approaches are all about. So we ask people to give feedback digitally on our outputs, but we also ask people during these sessions, when we went to these workshops, we also asked our community members and our stakeholder members to give verbal feedback as well, to collect qualitative information on the different topics that I brought up. So do you agree? Do you disagree? Is this useful? How can we make it more useful? Could this cause harm to your community by causing exposure or in other ways as well? How can we improve that? And so we held these workshops and collect some new numerical data and feedback on our models to improve it, but also some qualitative feedback to enrich the approaches that we're taking as well. Again, another aspect of the job that I really, really love. And so we had these three outputs, overall deprivation. Again, is it deprived or not deprived? And some sort of aspects of why it's important to model this and map this shown on the screen there. Another one about the planning of the city. So is it irregular or is it more regular? Is it a more formal area or is it a less formal area? And again, just some important factors of why we're mapping and creating these maps of a regular layout there shown on the screen. Another one showing the density and the size of structures. So does this cell have lots of buildings that are small and compact when versus another cell which might have buildings that are more larger, less compact, kind of what you see in a more formal or affluent area when you're looking at low to middle income countries. And so we ran these workshops, which I mentioned earlier, and we went to each city, went to Lagos, Kano, and Nairobi, and we ran these workshops. Myself and another colleague, Andy Clark, ran these workshops with different team members from our three pilot cities. So we ran it with loads of different community members, stakeholders, and we had various different people from different backgrounds, government, community, students, academics, and researchers involved in this process to provide feedback. And you can see here just some outputs from that, areas or cells where people have agreed and disagreed with the outputs that they are seeing. So really exciting stuff for us. We expected that we wouldn't get everything right. A model can never get it 100% right, but we want to know which bits we are getting right, which bits we're getting wrong, and where can we improve and make things more impactful and useful. Where we are at now is another phase. So you've kind of seen maps of things within a 2D space. So we've used satellite imagery to create some of these maps. We've used satellite imagery to train some of these machine learning, artificial intelligence, and deep learning models. And we've also used building footprint data to train these models as well. However, what we also want to experiment with, we want to understand whether or not other types of data sets, are they able to explain these spaces more accurately? One type of data set that we're hoping to work with in the next phase is Google Street View data. We want to try and understand whether or not a Google Street View image, so a panoramic image within Google Street View, can that explain what's going on within this space more holistically than using a combination of satellite imagery, Google footprint imagery, road imagery. Can Google Street View actually explain what's going on in this space more accurately and holistically and create maps of these different subdomains of water and sanitation, of flooding, of healthcare, of building morphometrics, of building quality, of green space? Can we use Google Street View imagery to do that? And so what we're doing in this next phase is we're going to be developing models that will feed and eat lots of different Google Street View images and other citizen science images that we've collected within the project and see whether or not it's able to paint a picture of these slums, of deprivation within these slums and these informal settlements and deprivation across the cities in general. Can it paint a picture better than using the other sort of data sets that we've been using and those methods that we've been using? So a really exciting time. I can't wait to get stuck into that. And that's kind of where we're at with the project. I'm going to wrap that up now, though, and talk to you about another aspect, which is just as important, which is part of the community of practice. It will be just another 4 minutes, and then we can open it up for discussion. So I mentioned earlier that I'm part of the community of practice. I lead a large community of practice that's full of lots of international members from different walks of life. This includes community members, stakeholders, lots and lots of different people, modelers, researchers, academics. And we get together every month or two and we talk sometimes about the work that we're doing. Sometimes it could be a method that somebody's found that is really exciting. We want to let everybody know about it. We might also want to talk about some of the work that we've been doing and get some feedback from it because we're stuck. But we also talk about some ongoing challenges that are happening globally. And one of the prominent challenges that came out of the previous community of practice was the recent floods in Nairobi and the forced evictions that are ongoing because of that. In May 2024, this year, there were huge, devastating floods, and floods, as we know, occur globally in many, many different cities and are becoming more and more frequent due to climate change and other sort of man-made factors as well, that densification and urbanization of cities and people living in precarious flood zones, etc. In Nairobi, however, we've had a real catastrophic flood which has displaced around 200,000 people and it's still growing. You can imagine thinking about the city of London and having 200,000 people displaced through a flood. It would be chaos. And so in Nairobi, we have 200,000 people that are displaced from their homes and currently have nowhere to go. These are people that have lived in precarious areas anyway, with sometimes little belongings and little finances to be able to support themselves, and now being told by the government that they have to leave their homes and live elsewhere. During the floods, of course, evacuating these communities was really important for their livelihoods. However, since then, these communities are no longer allowed to go back into their homes and they're now being demolished by the government. Some of these spaces are prime real estate. However, the communities have been living there for decades, if not centuries, and developers have been hot on the case here and have worked with the government to stop community members from coming into these spaces. So it's a really, really highly contentious zone. However, the livelihoods of some of these communities are at risk. People are homeless, they've lost all their belongings and have nowhere else to go. You can imagine, as I mentioned earlier, 200,000 people is such a vast amount of people. I mean, that's kind of the size of the city of Newcastle in the north. So having a large city of people totally displaced with nowhere to go, very little finances, and being offered $70 by the government to move and to rehome themselves. Now, of course, that's not possible here, but I'm telling you that that's also not possible in Nairobi either. To build a new home and to find somewhere new on $70 is really not possible in an area that's already so highly densely populated. So it's a very, very contentious topic. Lots of people displaced, their livelihoods at risk. And so there has been some international media coverage on the flooding. You might have seen some of the flooding coverage in the BBC and other sort of international news organizations as well. But what hasn't been covered is the forced evictions. And so we're seeing that, yeah, there's lots of coverage of the floods, but not so much covered by the international media of the aftermath of these evictions, with having 200,000 people evicted from their homes. And so what we're trying to do in the project now is we're kind of in the mid-end phase of the project. And so it's really important that we disseminate the knowledge that we've learned, the outputs that we've gathered, and also try and gain some traction on what's ongoing with some of the real key issues in Nairobi and some of these other pilot cities as well. What I'm trying to do here in today's session is just to raise an international understanding of what's actually going on and invite any of you, if you have blogs or if you have contacts in the media or if you are active on Twitter, to please reach out. Get in touch. I'll leave my contact details with Rob, as I mentioned earlier. If you want to get in touch with me about the project, you want to talk in more detail about anything that I've mentioned today, please get in touch. But more importantly, please do get in touch if you would like to get involved in disseminating some of these materials that I've shown earlier today. We do have a media pack If you do know anybody in the media, if you do want to sort of tweet or if you have a blog, let me know. We've got all the media available, and yeah, really invite you to jump on board and collaborate there. Just want to thank you again for your time here. It's really exciting for me to come back. I was a bursary holder from the Worshipful Company of Water Conservators when I was doing my masters, and without you guys, I wouldn't have been able to do my master's research at Queen Mary University of London. And it was really there that I developed my love for these topics, love for conservation, environmentalism, and sustainability. So just want to say a big thank you as well for that. And I'll stop talking. Thank you.